By noon, everyone in Dry Creek knew the Apache camp had 9 days left. 12 rustlers had taken 186 horses, the hunters' mounts, the pack animals, and the only way 43 people could cross Crow's Spine before the first hard freeze. The sheriff called it an Indian problem. The merchants locked their doors, and when one worn-out freight rider asked for volunteers, the whole street looked away. So Silas Mercer saddled his black mare and rode alone. 3 days later, he came back with every stolen horse. The Apache chief laid 20 braided marriage cords at his feet. But the only woman Silas wanted was the one who looked him in the eye and said, "I am not your reward." Silas Mercer had spent most of his 31 years leaving places before anyone could ask him to stay. He hauled medicine, lamp oil, mail sacks, and machine parts between settlements scattered across the New Mexico territory. He slept under wagons when rooms cost too much, ate from tin plates, and trusted exactly one living creature without reservation. Her name was Cinder. She was a dark bay Mustang mare with a black mane, a white mark beneath her left eye, and the bad habit of biting anyone who tried to saddle her besides Silas. They understood each other. Both had been handled too roughly when they were young. Both had learned to survive by keeping distance. On the afternoon Silas rode into Dry Creek. The wind was pushing red dust through the street hard enough to sting. He had been 3 days on the freight road and wanted nothing more than water, beans, and a corner where no one would speak to him. Then he saw the crowd outside the sheriff's office. A gray-haired trader stood in the middle of it, shouting over the wind. They took the whole remuda, every horse. A broad man in a clean vest laughed. "Then let the Apaches chase them." "They cannot," the trader said. "Half their riders are sick. Their winter camp is on the other side of Crow's Spine, and snow is coming early." The sheriff leaned against the porch post, thumbs hooked in his belt. No crime was reported by any citizen of Dry Creek. The trader stared at him. "Those people trade here. They guided your survey crews. 2 months ago they pulled your nephew out of a flash flood." The sheriff's face hardened. "Careful." Silas dismounted. Cinder flicked one ear toward the argument. "How many rustlers?" Silas asked. The clean-vested man looked him over. Dusty coat, worn boots, scar under the jaw, no badge, no money worth stealing. 12, maybe 13, he said. Harlan Voss and his crew. That name changed the air. Voss had robbed freight wagons from Santa Fe to the border. He did not take prisoners when prisoners could identify him. Silas looked at the trader. "How many horses?" 186. "How far ahead?" 2 days, and no one here is riding. A few men smiled. One actually laughed. The sheriff pushed away from the post. "You new to this territory, stranger?" "No, then you should know better." Silas studied the faces around him. Ranch hands who had guns, store owners who had sons, men who spoke loudly about courage when the danger belonged to someone else. He had seen that look before. 19 years earlier, he had stood beside a burned wagon while his father bled into the sand. 3 riders had passed on the road. They saw the smoke. They saw the boy waving both arms. They kept going. His father lived until sunset. Silas had never forgotten the sound of hooves moving away. He took Cinder's reins. "Which direction?" The laughter stopped. The trader pointed northwest. "Black glass wash. Voss will drive them toward Crow's Spine, then sell them in the mining camps." The sheriff shook his head. "You will not make 10 miles. Silas put his boot in the stirrup. "Then you will not have far to carry me back." He swung into the saddle. The gray-haired trader stepped close and lowered his voice. "There is one thing you should know. The lead mare wears a brass bell. Small thing, dull sound, but the whole herd follows her." Silas nodded. "What is she called?" "Mica." The trader handed him a strip of rawhide with a little brass clapper tied to it. "Found this near the North Trail. It may be from her bell." Silas closed his hand around it. A piece of metal no larger than his thumb. A sound 185 frightened animals had been trained to trust. That was all the plan he had. He rode until Dry Creek disappeared behind the dust. By dusk, the flat land had risen into broken hills. The wind sharpened. Cinder's breath showed white in the cooling air. Silas found tracks near a dry arroyo. Hundreds of hoofprints. 12 shod horses circling the outside. One animal dragging a hind foot. Voss was moving fast but not cleanly. Silas followed until moonrise, then made camp beneath a shelf of stone. He kept the fire small and the rifle across his knees. He had just begun to close his eyes when Cinder raised her head. Not startled, listening, Silas reached for the rifle. A voice came from the dark. "If you lift it, I will put an arrow through your hand." The speaker stepped into the firelight. He was close to Silas's age, lean, broad-shouldered, with long dark hair tied back and a blanket coat dusted from travel. A bow rested in his left hand, his right hand was empty. Silas did not lift the rifle. "Good," the man said. "You have a name, Tomas? You have been following me?" "Since Dry Creek." Silas glanced toward the ridge. "You heard the town." "I heard men explain why children should freeze." There was no anger in Tomas's voice. That made it heavier. Silas shifted the rifle away from his knees. "The horses belong to your people. They belong to families. Some carry hunters. Some carry old people. 6 are milk mares. 9 were raised by children who have never slept a night without them nearby." Silas looked into the coals. "How long before your camp has to move?" 9 days, maybe 7 if the weather turns. "And you came alone?" Tomas gave a faint smile. "So did you." For a while, neither man spoke. Then Tomas crouched beside the tracks Silas had studied. "You missed something." He pointed to a mark half hidden under loose gravel. "A narrow groove beside one hoofprint. Hobble chain," he said. "They chained the lead mare. They know the herd follows her." "Mica." Tomas's eyes lifted. "You know her name. I know her bell matters. It matters more than your rifle." Silas opened his hand and showed the brass clapper. Tomas took one breath through his nose, then he sat across the fire. "Perhaps," he said. "You are not completely foolish. That disappoints me. I was starting to think we had something in common." The corner of Tomas's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was close. At first light they rode together. Tomas read the country as if every stone had spoken to him. He knew where Voss had watered the herd, where a rider had dismounted to tighten a girth, where one rustler had stopped long enough to vomit beside a cactus. Silas knew freight roads, saddle leather, and the habits of thieves. By noon they understood what the other man could do. By evening they had stopped explaining every decision. The trail narrowed between walls of black volcanic rock. Crow's Spine rose ahead, jagged and dark against the western sky. Tomas pointed to a line of clouds gathered above it. "Snow tomorrow night." Silas counted the miles in his head. "If we take the herd back the way they came, we lose a day. There is another route, a water-cut passage through the east wall." "Wide enough for 186 horses? Barely. Voss knows it?" "No." Silas looked at him. "How certain are you?" Tomas considered. "My grandmother showed it to me when I was 12. That was not the answer I hoped for. It is the answer you have." They pushed on. Near sunset they found one of the stolen horses down in a shallow ravine. A chestnut gelding lay breathing hard, its hind leg cut by wire. Tomas dismounted before Silas could speak. He knelt beside the animal and ran careful hands down the swollen leg. "We cannot leave him. If Voss looks back, he will know someone is following. He already knows the horse fell." Silas watched the darkening trail. Every minute mattered. So did the animal. He took a small wire cutter from his saddlebag and freed the gelding's leg. Tomas packed the wound with clean cloth and a resin salve. They raised the horse together. It could walk slowly. Tomas looped its lead to his saddle. "You just cost us an hour," Silas said. "Yes." "You would do it again?" "Yes." Silas looked at the wounded horse, then at Tomas. "Good." They traveled through the night. The gelding slowed them, but it also gave them something they had not expected. Near dawn, the horse lifted its head and answered a distant call, a mare, then another. The stolen herd was close. They left their horses and crawled to the edge of a basalt ridge. Below them, in a bowl-shaped valley, Voss had built a rough camp. Canvas shelters formed a half-circle around a rope corral. Fires burned low. 2 men watched the herd. A third sat on a rock shelf above the valley with a rifle. Silas counted 12. Tomas pointed toward a small pen beside the tents. Mica stood inside it alone. She was a pale gray mare with a dark stripe down her back. A heavy chain bound her front legs. The brass bell still hung beneath her throat, packed with cloth so it could not ring. Voss had understood the herd. He had separated its memory from its body. Silas watched the horses press toward Mica whenever she moved. "The corral rope is rawhide," he whispered. "Wet it, then cut halfway through. It will hold until the herd leans." Tomas nodded toward the lookout. "I take the ridge. I get the mare. And the 2 guards? One problem at a time." Tomas's expression said he did not admire the plan. Silas's expression said there was no better one. They waited for full darkness. Clouds covered the moon. The temperature dropped fast. The first flakes of snow drifted across the ridge and vanished on the warm stone. Tomas disappeared uphill. Silas slid down toward the camp. He moved through greasewood and shadow, stopping whenever a guard turned. The rustlers were tired. Their boots dragged. One drank from a bottle each time he passed the east side of the corral. Silas reached the rawhide line. He dipped a rag into a water skin and wrapped it around the rope. Then he sawed halfway through with his knife, leaving the outer fibers intact. The herd shifted. 185 bodies made a sound like distant rain. Silas crossed behind a tent. Inside, a man snored. A tin cup rolled under a cot. Silas froze. No one woke. He reached Mica's pen. The mare backed away, eyes wide. "Easy," he whispered. "I know. I would not trust me either." He held out the brass clapper. Mica stretched her nose toward it. The piece touched the side of her bell. Every horse in the valley raised its head. Silas stopped breathing. A guard looked toward the pen. What was that? The other guard shrugged. Wind. Mica touched the metal again. A quieter chime. The herd pressed against the corral line. Silas removed the cloth from inside the bell, then worked at the chain around her legs. The lock was not a lock. It was twisted baling wire. He cut one turn, then another. A boot scraped behind him. "Move your hand away from the mare." Silas turned slowly. Harlan Voss stood 10 feet away, revolver leveled at his chest. Voss was smaller than Silas expected. Narrow face, pale eyes, a black coat too fine for the trail. "Dry Creek send you?" Voss asked. "No, the army, no." Voss smiled. "Then no one will miss you." From the ridge came the abrupt cry of a night bird. Tomas's signal. The lookout was down. Silas looked at Voss's gun. Voss looked at Silas's knife. Both men understood the distance. Neither moved. Then Mica swung her head. The brass bell rang once hard. The herd surged. The weakened rawhide line snapped. Silas dropped behind the mare as Voss fired. The bullet tore through the top rail. Horses poured out of the corral. The valley exploded into motion. Silas cut the last wire from Mica's legs. She lunged forward, bell hammering beneath her neck. The herd turned toward her as if pulled by a single rope. Voss fired again. Silas felt the heat of the shot beside his ear. Then the camp went black. Tomas had kicked the lantern rack into the water trough. Silas ran for Cinder. Rustlers stumbled from tents, grabbing rifles, shouting contradictory orders. Two tried to saddle their horses and found their cinches sliced through. Tomas had done more than silence the lookout. He had taken pursuit away. Silas mounted Cinder and drove toward Mica's left side. Tomas appeared on the right, bow in hand, the rescued gelding trailing behind him. They pushed the herd toward the east wall. For half a mile the plan worked. Then Voss found a horse with an intact saddle. 3 men climbed bareback onto others. Gunshots cracked behind the herd. A bullet struck stone near Silas's knee. Another horse screamed and stumbled. "Faster!" Silas shouted. Tomas pointed toward a dark split in the rock. "The passage!" They angled the herd. Snow thickened. The hidden wash was less than 20 feet wide, barely visible behind a stand of juniper. Mica reached it first, then a flame rose ahead. Voss had sent one rider around the ridge. The man dragged a burning branch through dry brush at the mouth of the wash. Fire raced along the grass. The led horses recoiled. The entire herd folded backward on itself. Silas fought Cinder's reins as animals crowded from both sides. A gray colt went down. 2 mares nearly trampled it. Tomas jumped from his saddle and pulled the colt by the halter until it found its feet. A rifle cracked. Tomas spun and fell. Everything inside Silas went still. He saw the herd turning away from the passage. He saw Voss's riders closing from behind. He saw Tomas on the ground, one hand pressed to his side. For 1 second the choice was clean. Save the horses, or save the man. 19 years earlier, 3 riders had chosen the road. Silas swung down. He ran through the crush, grabbed Tomas beneath the arms, and dragged him behind a rock shelf. "You should be with the herd," Tomas gasped. "You should complain less." The bullet went through. "Then keep the hole closed." Silas tore a strip from his shirt and packed the wound. Behind them, Mica's bell rang wildly as the herd scattered away from the fire. Voss shouted from the slope, "Leave the Apache." "You might still ride out." Silas looked toward the rustlers. Then he looked at the brass clapper still tied to his wrist, the little piece the trader had found. The sound the herd remembered. He pulled it free. "Tomas, where does the wash come out?" "East side." "Below the white cliffs. Is there water? A narrow stream, enough to stop fire?" "Yes." Silas stood. Tomas caught his sleeve. "What are you doing?" "Giving them something to follow." Silas ran to Cinder and mounted. Smoke rolled across the valley. Horses milled in blind panic. Voss's riders pushed from the rear, trying to turn them back toward camp. Silas rode straight into the smoke. He could not see Mica. He could barely see Cinder's ears. He struck the brass clapper against his saddle horn. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound was thin, almost foolish against the fire and shouting. Then another bell answered. "Mica." Silas called into the smoke. "Come on, girl. Bring them home." The pale mare appeared 10 yards away. Silas turned Cinder toward the burning mouth of the wash. The flames were low but wide. Cinder stopped so hard her front feet carved trenches in the dirt. Silas leaned over her neck. "You and me," he whispered. "One more bad idea." Cinder trembled. Then she jumped. They cleared the burning grass. Mica followed. The first mares followed Mica, then the geldings, then the colts. The herd streamed through the fire and into the narrow wash, drawn by the bell, shoulder to shoulder, sparks twisting above their backs. Voss's men tried to follow. Their borrowed horses refused the flames. One rider forced his mount forward and was thrown into the dirt. Silas reached the stream beyond the smoke. He turned and counted shapes as they emerged. 20, 50, 100, more. Tomas appeared last, slumped over the wounded gelding but still in the saddle. Silas rode to him. "You stubborn fool." Tomas opened one eye. "Two fools." The herd filled the hidden passage. Behind them the fire cut Voss off. Ahead the first gray light of morning touched the white cliffs. They had the horses, but they were not safe yet. Tomas could not ride hard. The wounded gelding could not keep pace. Snow covered the trail as fast as they made it. Silas kept the herd moving east, then south along the stream. Mica's bell did most of the work. Each time the horses began to spread, she stepped forward and the others gathered around the sound. At midday, Tomas nearly fell. Silas caught him. "We stop. We lose time. You lose blood. The camp needs the horses. The camp needs you." Tomas tried to argue. Silas gave him the look Cinder usually received before a difficult river crossing. Tomas stopped arguing. They sheltered beneath an overhang. Silas cleaned the wound with boiled water and pressed fresh cloth into place. The bullet had passed through flesh below the ribs. Painful, dangerous, but not immediately fatal. Tomas watched his hands. "You have done this before. Freet routes teach ugly lessons. Your father?" Silas paused. "Bandits, I was 12. No one helped. 3 men saw us." Tomas closed his eyes. After a moment he said, "That is why you rode." Silas tied the bandage. "That is why I stopped," Snow whispered beyond the overhang. Tomas opened his eyes again. "My sister will say I chose a foolish brother." "You have a sister? Amaya. What is she like?" "She sees lies before the speaker finishes them." "Then I already dislike her." "No, you are already afraid of her." Silas almost smiled. They rested until the bleeding slowed, then they rode. Late the following afternoon, the mountains opened into a wide valley of cottonwood and winter grass. Smoke rose from a cluster of shelters near the river. A child spotted the herd first. His shout traveled across the camp. People came running, not cheering at first. They seemed unable to believe what they saw. Then Mica's bell reached them. An old woman dropped the basket in her hands. 2 children ran past her, calling the names of horses. Men rushed to help Tomas from the saddle. Women moved among the animals, checking legs, touching faces, counting. One little girl found the gray colt that had fallen in the crush. She wrapped both arms around its neck and buried her face in its mane. Silas looked away. Some moments were too private for a stranger. A woman approached Cinder. She was in her late 20s with dark eyes, black hair braided down her back, and a deerskin coat lined for winter. A knife hung at her belt. Her hands were stained with crushed herbs. She did not look at Silas first. She looked at Cinder. "Your mare crossed fire," she said. Silas glanced at the singed hair along Cinder's foreleg. "She did, because you asked. Because she decided." The woman touched Cinder's shoulder, slow enough not to startle her. Cinder pinned one ear, considered biting, then allowed the touch. That impressed Silas more than beauty would have. The woman looked up. "You brought my brother back. Your brother brought the horses back." "That is not what I said." Silas understood. "Yes, I brought him back." She held his gaze for a long moment. "I am Amaya." Of course she was. Tomas had not exaggerated. She saw too much. Before Silas could answer, an elder stepped through the crowd. He was tall despite his age, wrapped in a dark blanket, silver hair tied at the nape of his neck. The camp quieted. Tomas spoke to him in Apache, slowly because of the pain. He pointed once toward Silas, once toward the herd, then toward the snow gathering over Crow's spine. The elder listened without interruption. When Tomas finished, the elder faced Silas. "My son says you chose his life when the horses were being lost." Silas shifted under the attention of the whole camp. The horses were not lost. They might have been. So might he. The elder's expression softened. "What do you ask in return?" "Food for my mare, a place for Tomas to lie down, nothing else." A murmur passed through the people. The elder studied him. A man who asks for nothing may be honest, or may not yet know what he needs. Silas glanced at Amaya. She noticed. That was unfortunate. The elder said, "Tonight you eat with us. Tomorrow we speak again." Amaya took Tomas by the arm. As she led him away, she looked back at Silas. Not warmly, not coldly, as if he were a difficult question she intended to answer. That night the camp ate well for the first time in weeks. The hunters had been unable to travel without horses, and food had grown thin. Now meat roasted over the fires. Children sat beside the recovered animals. Old people touched Mica's brass bell as they passed, each one hearing in it the winter they had almost lost. Silas sat beside Tomas, who had ignored every instruction to remain lying down. Amaya brought broth and set it between them. For him, she said, pointing to Tomas. Then she placed a second bowl in front of Silas, and for the other fool. Tomas smiled into his cup. Silas said, "He told you. He tells me everything when fever makes him weak." "I have no fever," Tomas said. "You are sweating in snow. I am near the fire." Amaya ignored him. She looked at the strip of burned leather on Silas's sleeve. "You rode through flame. Cinder did most of the work. You always give your horse the credit." "She complains less than people." Amaya sat across from him. "Why did you help us?" Silas had expected gratitude. He had not expected an examination. "Because Voss stole what was not his. Men steal from us often. Then more men should stop them. That is not an answer." Silas set down the bowl. Around them voices rose and fell. The smell of wood smoke, horse sweat, and roasting meat filled the cold air. "My father died beside a freight wagon," he said. 3 riders could have helped. They decided his life belonged to someone else's problem. Amaya's face changed, only slightly, but he saw it. "I was 12, Silas continued. "I have spent 19 years hearing those horses ride away." Amaya looked toward Mica. The bell moved gently when the mare lowered her head to feed. "And today?" she asked. "Today I heard a different bell." Amaya said nothing more, but when she stood, she took his empty bowl with the others. That small gesture felt like permission to remain near the fire. At sunrise, the elder called the camp together. 20 braided cords had been laid across a blanket. Each was different: red wool, horsehair, blue thread, beads of bone and shell. Silas stopped at the edge of the gathering. He looked at Tomas. Tomas looked entirely too pleased. The elder spoke. 20 families have asked that you be invited to become kin." Silas stared at the cords. The elder continued before Silas could misunderstand. "No woman here is property. No marriage is payment. Each cord is an invitation to speak, to be known, and perhaps to build a life, but only if both hearts agree." Silas breathed again. Several young women stood with their families. Some smiled, some studied him with open curiosity. Amaya stood apart, arms folded. There was no cord at her feet. The elder gestured toward the blanket. "You may accept one invitation, or none." Silas walked past the cords. A whisper moved through the crowd. He stopped before Amaya. Her eyes narrowed. "You were not invited here," she said. "I noticed. Then why are you standing in front of me?" "Because you are the only person in this camp who has not decided I am better than I am." A few people laughed softly. Amaya did not. "You saved lives," she said. "That does not give you the right to choose a wife." "I agree." Now the crowd was silent. Silas held out the brass clapper from Mica's bell. "I am not choosing a wife," he said. "I am asking whether you would walk with me by the river. Once. No promise beyond that." Amaya looked at the metal in his palm, then at him. "I am not your reward." Silas closed his fingers around the clapper. "No," he said. "You are the reason I would have to become worthy of one." For the first time, Amaya smiled. It was small, dangerous, and completely real. "One walk," she said. Tomas leaned toward the elder. "I warned him she was difficult." Amaya turned her head. "Your wound can still become infected." Tomas became silent. The walk lasted until noon. Amaya showed Silas where the river narrowed beneath cottonwoods, where medicinal plants survived under snow, and where the children trained young horses away from the main camp. She asked about Cinder. He told her the mare had been trapped in a trader's rope pen, starved and striking at anyone who came near. Silas bought her with 6 months of wages because her eyes looked familiar. "You saved her," Amaya said. "No, I opened the gate. She decided not to run." Amaya considered that. "You understand the difference." "I am learning." Over the next week, the camp prepared to cross Crow's Spine. Silas could have left. The freight road waited. Dry Creek waited. His cabin with 1 chair and no voices waited. Instead, he repaired pack saddles, helped Tomas walk without reopening the wound, and worked beside Amaya as she checked every recovered horse. 9 animals had wire cuts, 3 had saddle sores. The chestnut gelding needed daily treatment. Silas stayed because the work needed hands. At least, that was what he told himself. The truth was simpler. For the first time in 19 years, people noticed when he was missing from a meal. Children asked him to tell the story of the fire jump. Tomas called him brother when he thought no one was listening, and each evening Amaya found some reason to pass near Cinder. The crossing began before dawn on the 8th day. 186 horses moved through the snow in a long dark line. Packs creaked, breath steamed. Mica walked near the front, her bell ringing softly between the cliffs. Silas rode beside Amaya. At the highest point of Crow's Spine, the wind struck hard enough to bend the grass flat. Below them, the country opened toward the winter valley. Amaya pulled her horse close. When we reached the other side, "Will you go back to your road?" Silas looked ahead. He had spent his life believing freedom meant leaving before anyone could hold him. Now, with Mica's bell moving through the snow, leaving felt like the only cage he had ever known. "I have a cabin south of Dry Creek," he said. "One room, bad roof. That sounds impressive." "It has a door. Luxury." He smiled. "I could sell it." Amaya watched him carefully. "And then I could ask for another walk." Her expression softened. "You may need many. I have stopped being in a hurry. The winter was hard. But no one in the camp froze. The recovered horses carried hunters, food, blankets, children, and elders across the mountains before the heavy snow closed the pass. Mica delivered a healthy foal in January. The wounded chestnut survived. Tomas healed badly at first, then well. Silas sold the cabin. He bought flour, salt, needles, and 2 iron stoves, then returned before the spring thaw. He did not arrive as a rescuer. He arrived as a man ready to work. Amaya made him wait 3 more months before she accepted a marriage cord. When she finally did, she braided it herself from red wool, black horsehair, and a single thin strip of leather cut from Silas's fire-scorched sleeve. They married beside the river in early summer. Tomas stood on one side of them. Cinder stood on the other and tried to bite anyone who came too close. Years later, travelers still told the story wrong. They said an Apache chief rewarded a white cowboy with his choice of 20 women. Silas corrected them every time. He had not been given a woman. He had been offered a place among people who understood that courage could open a gate, but only love could make a man stay. He rode into Crow's Spine chasing 186 stolen horses. He came out with a brother, a wife, and the first sound in his life that ever called him home.